teaching them for 2 years now, online, and our on-campus students on campus. So we've been doing hybrid teaching. It's been a bit complicated, but we're managing. It's all right.
Yeah. A similar story, I think, in most parts of the world. We are also kind of doing administrative work from the campus, but teaching online.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's changed everything, hasn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Amol, I think it's time. So.
Yeah, we are waiting for Nadim's signal.
Okay.
Okay.
So as soon as it's gone live, we'll start.
Just finish my tea quickly.
Do we need to record it again here as well, Nadeem, or does the live session get recorded?
Yes, we are going to record.
So let us know when it's time to start, Nadeem.
Yes, sir. 1 minute only.
Recording in progress.
Sir, we are live.
Hello,
sir, we
and
are
welcome.
Live.
Hello, and very good morning to those in India, and good afternoon, good evening to people from other parts of the world. This is the National Teachers' Day in India. So on this occasion, I wish everyone a very happy Teachers' Day. We are extremely delighted to welcome you to this Ainet Foundation Day lecture. I would like to request our President, Dr. Vivek Joshi, to preside over this session and just say one quick word of welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Amal Padwad, Secretary, Ainet Association of English Teachers, for inviting me to be in the chair of this very milestone kind of a lecture that we are going to have. I welcome Dr. Harry Barkhuizen on this occasion, and I wish all Ainet members and English teachers on this day. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Padwad.
Thank you very much. We will, before we begin this lecture today, since it's an anniversary day for Ainet, I would like to take this opportunity to quickly tell all our members of the audience a few things about Ainet. Ainet began about 10 years ago as an online informal community and continued so for nearly 5 years, during which time we managed to have a lot of following and conduct lots of activities like international conferences, national conferences, workshops, seminars, etc. Later, we got registered as a charity, and in that new version, we still continue to work and be as vibrant as ever. We are essentially a community which is democratic, transparent, inclusive, and focusing on professional development of everyone. But one word is important in our logo. We talk of development, but we talk of development together. So we firmly believe that together we can do a lot many things which none of us can do alone. On this occasion of Ainet anniversary and the National Teachers' Day, I once again wish everyone. And before I introduce Gary, Professor Gary Barkhuizen, let me quickly share a few forthcoming activities of Ainet, which many of you will find quite interesting. And we are also giving a standing invitation to all those people who are interested to join us there. Two recent activities we have begun is a teacher narratives series, wherein we are inviting teachers to share their personal stories from their lives as English teachers. This is an ongoing series, and therefore feel free to share your stories whenever you can. We propose to publish the first in the series next month on the 5th October, the World Teachers' Day. In addition to that, we are also going to publish an anthology of poems because we teachers often give a creative response to our experiences, challenges, and try to bring the creative side of us forward. On this occasion, today in the evening, there will be an ELT Mushaira, where a few English teachers will be reading their poems out. But this collection of poems will continue. Therefore, please consider this as an open invitation and please share your poems as well. The deadline for sending your poems is 30th of September. Please note that your poem should be related to your life as an English teacher. On the occasion of our foundation week from 1st to 7th September, we have also announced very heavy discount in our membership. For everyone, it is 20% of the regular fees. And for women in particular, it is 50% of the fees. On 15th September, the Ainet Connect team, which is the team of volunteer teachers looking after various social media accounts of Ainet, the Twitter team will organize a tweet chat on the theme Back to School. That is on 15th September. Do join. Everyone is welcome. We also have a project called Women in Ainet, which is consciously trying to increase not only the representation of women in Ainet, but also much greater representation of women in the leadership roles in Ainet. This project is underway at the moment, and the project team will hold 2 panel discussions on 25th September and 2nd October, wherein they are inviting women teachers of English from all over the world as well as from India to share their experiences of tackling with the pandemic challenges. Next month, 5th October is the World Teachers Day, and we will have another series of events on the day. Please watch this space for more announcements to come. The next international conference in the series, the 6th Ainet International Conference. Our international conferences happen every 2 years. So next one is due in January 2022, 7th, 8th, and 9th January. And very soon we are bringing out a detailed announcement. We also have lots of very valuable, interesting projects going on. Ainet Connect project is a very in-house kind of project where our own member teachers, volunteers have formed small teams to look after various Ainet social media accounts. We have teams looking after Instagram, Telegram, Twitter, WhatsApp, YouTube, Facebook, etc. Please join all these media accounts because that's one interesting way and very quick way to keep in touch with the developments at Ainet. Ainet Affiliates project is where we try to connect with lots of formal and informal associations, groups, and communities of English teachers scattered all over the country. There are hundreds of them all around. And true to our vision, we believe that if all those communities come together, there are mutual benefits for everyone. Women in Ainet project, as I said earlier, looks into how we can increase the representation of women in membership as well as in leadership. History of English Language Education in India is an informal group which is supported by Ainet. Right now, a small project is underway in which we are looking at English textbooks from the colonial India. And Decentering ALT is a recent initiative which has started globally. Ainet is also supporting it and as an important part of it. So in all these projects, you will continue to hear more details and activities. Please do join if you are interested. Please also do join our various social media accounts. In case you need more information or details, please contact the Ainet number. You can also send a WhatsApp message here. Thank you very much for your patience, Professor Gary Barkhuizen. I would like to introduce you before you begin your talk. Professor Gary is a professor of applied linguistics at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. His teaching and research interests are in the areas of language teacher education, teacher and learner identity, study abroad, and narrative inquiry. He has taught English at high school in South Africa, at college level in United States, and he has been involved in teacher education for over 20 years in New Zealand. He has written a number of books as well as edited several volumes in the areas of his interest, especially language teacher education, teacher identity, and narrative inquiry. His recent book published this year is Language Teacher Educator Identity, which was published by Cambridge University Press. A book he co-wrote actually with Pat Strauss, which was published by Routledge in 2020 under the title Communicating Identities, is a shortlisted finalist in the 2021 British Council Elton's Innovations Awards. And we do look forward to reading more such innovative and valuable publications from you. One more thing I would like to add about Professor Gary is his not only down-to-earth nature, but his rootedness in ground reality. He has a first-hand experience of teaching in various contexts, and not just academic interests, but much more wider range of interests as well. So with these words, I'm really delighted to invite Professor Gary for his talk today. Over to you, Professor Gary.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. You make me feel very welcome straight away. I really do appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the talk today. In fact, I'm honored to be invited on this special occasion for Ainet's Foundation Week, and Happy Teachers Day to everybody. This is a very special occasion, and as I said, I'm really honored to be a part of it. I'm planning to talk about teacher identity today. Obviously, teacher identity is something that we all think about and talk about and share stories about all the time, because as teachers, who we are and how other people see us is important in every single thing that we do in our lives as teachers, in the classroom, with our learners, with our colleagues, in schools, in communities, and so on. So teacher identity is a vitally important part of the work that we do, of our professional development. So I'm going to be talking today about teacher identity, and let me see if I can share my screen and show you some of the topics that I will be planning to share with you. I will talk a little bit about what identity means generally, just to give a little bit of a theoretical background. I don't want to spend too much time on theory because we've got more interesting things to talk about, but I do want to talk just a little bit about theory and also what we mean by language teacher identity. And I'll share some teacher stories with you where they display and construct their identities in the stories that they tell about the work that they do. I want to talk a little bit about how teachers can go about reflecting on their identities and even more systematically inquiring into their identities. And I want to give a focus to stories or to narrative, the way that through narrative or through the stories that we share in our everyday lives, but more systematically through the stories that we live and share and tell as teachers, we can learn more about ourselves as teachers and more about the work we do and more about our learners and their needs and so on. I've also got a story which tells the story of a teacher, she's a language teacher, English teacher, but also a teacher educator who is interested in doing research, but experiences a dilemma in her life as a teacher, a dilemma relating to her teaching role and her researcher role, the different types of research that she finds she wants to do and she needs to do, depending on her imagined goals in life. So these are some of the topics I'm going to explore. This is not the order that I will necessarily follow, as you can see on the screen. These are just some of the topics I hope to address. If we got time, I may suggest some identity topics to reflect on specifically, or for those interested in doing some action research or exploratory practice, some topics that are quite interesting to explore related to teacher identity. But if we don't have time, that's okay. I can share my slides and you can have a look at them at a later stage. Okay, so let's get right into it and have a look at this story. This is a story of a teacher, or from a teacher rather, who came to New Zealand from Cambodia. And what she did was, while she was in New Zealand as an international student, she came to study abroad, and she came to New Zealand to do a master's in TESOL, to do her master's degree in TESOL. And a colleague and I there was a group of them, but this is one of those teachers. And when she had finished her master's in TESOL, she went back to Cambodia. And we were interested in how much value she got out of the study abroad experience. And we held a number of interviews. She wrote reflective journals and so on. And there was quite a bit of data we collected. But this was an interesting story she told as part of one of the interviews we held with her. And it dealt with the value of study abroad for her. So she's back in Cambodia, and we were talking to her. We were there too, actually, and we were talking to her about her experience of doing the TESOL, the Masters in TESOL, as an in-service teacher, very experienced teacher, who went to study further in New Zealand. And we were talking about the value of that experience in her life. And so she said, I would divide it into two parts. And without reading further, just have a look at the screen and you can see what those two parts are highlighted in red: the personal experiences and her professional career. So these were the two parts that related to the value in the study abroad experience. But as we read it, what I want you to notice is that these two parts that she refers to relate to two aspects of her identity, all right? So she says, first of all, it's about personal experience. The experience of going to study abroad has made me much more mature. So as a person, she has developed, this personal development has made her more mature. There's been some sort of personal growth through the study abroad experience. Line 4, and I've learned to be more humble, more grateful, and tolerant to different changes in general. So you can see there's been some development in her life, in who she is, in her identity. Because I've seen the world much bigger than I was in Cambodia. So I'm moving out of her life and her the familiarity with life in Cambodia. She's seen a much larger world and therefore has developed personally. So in line 6, so I've learned so much about life in terms of that. All right, part 1. Part 2, and also in terms of my professional career. So now she's talking about the other value she got out of the study abroad, further study in New Zealand, because I got a chance to do my master's degree. So I learned about teaching practices in the teaching system in New Zealand. So I can incorporate some of those over to my workplace. So this is post-sojourn, after the journey. She's now back in Cambodia, and professionally, she has now developed because she's learned some new teaching practices. And later on in the interview, when we talk to her, she won't simply take those practices and use them in Cambodia, but they will make her think about how she could possibly change what she does in her workplace in Cambodia. She won't simply use them wholesale, but she will reflect on them and see how they could be adapted to what she normally would do. And later in the interview, she explains how she has, in fact, adapted some of her teaching practices, particularly in terms of online teaching and so on. So this was fairly recent, just during the start of the COVID pandemic. And so she had to incorporate a number of changes. And she says that she learned from her experiences from her time in New Zealand. So professionally, her identity also changed by learning through the study abroad experience. But crucially, what's important in this story is that she makes this distinction, interrelated, nevertheless, distinction between her personal experiences and her professional career experiences. And Patsy Duff has referred to this in this quote. I'll explain a little later where this reference comes from, but just for now, have a look at this reference. She says language teacher identity arises, is constructed, it comes from the intersection within and across two particular sets of factors. Personal biography, so your own story, your own history, where you come from, and B, local socio-educational context. So she's making a similar distinction here, but she says they intersect, the intersection of one's personal biography, one's own, where one comes from, one's history, one's experiences, one's own story, and local socio-educational context, the context of teaching and learning. And she says social because, of course, education is a social endeavor, right? She talks about these contexts as being local. And I like that because when you looked at the story beforehand, the teacher says, I can now incorporate that what I learned into my workplace here, my local workplace. I just want to go back to the story quickly. And if you have a look at it, you can see from a story, from a biography perspective, remember Patsy Duff talks about a personal biography. By biography, we mean one story. And if you have a look at this story, the bits that are highlighted in red are the refer to the narrator of the story, which is who is the teacher. So I would divide it into my personal has made me, and I've learned in line 5 because I've seen, I've learned, my professional, my, I, all these pronouns, placing her, the narrator of the story, in the center of the story. And then you have a look at what I've put in blue. These are sort of social spaces or even physical places that relate to the narrator of the story. So when we're thinking about the identity of this teacher, she, in the story, is relating who she is to the workplace, where she works and where she studied. Not only on the micro level, you know, of being in the classroom or these teaching practices in my workplace, but also on a more macro level. So, you know, she talks about Cambodia, a whole country, New Zealand, a whole country. So in looking at identity, we develop our identities and construct our identities, not only in these micro spaces of the classroom with our learners and maybe in the school with other teachers, but also in these macro big spaces of whole countries even. And in study abroad, there are these global practices that this teacher is making sense of in her life. She talks about the teaching practices in the teaching system in New Zealand. And obviously she can't simply take that and put it in Cambodia, and I don't think she would want to do that. But having had the study abroad experience, what it means is that she's now had to rethink what she does. She's now been forced to look at ways in which she normally practices and compare them with what she came across in New Zealand and see what she can implement in her workplace in Cambodia. So all of that thinking and comparing and the narrating of who I am from my perspective in relation to these places and these spaces and these systems makes the teacher have to undergo identity shaping and reshaping. Okay, so I think that's a lovely story just to get us going. And if we take a step back now and we look at what we mean by identity, I always like to start with this quote. It's a very simple, straightforward quote by James Dee. And he said identity is being recognized as a certain kind of person in a given context. So what kind of person are you? Well, that's my identity, right? But he adds in a given context. And I think that's important because you're not just a person floating around in a vacuum, but you're a particular kind of person in a particular, as Patsy Duff said, socio-educational context. It could be a geopolitical context, or it could be a family context. So there's always some sort of space or context in which you are being a particular kind of person. So that's good. So our identity, in other words, is partly how other people see us, how we are recognized by other people, but it's also how we see ourselves, our understanding of who we are in a particular context. So it works both ways. It's not only how others see us, but also how we see ourselves. But from a teacher's perspective, it's so much more than this. Of course, this is just a broad definition, I guess. It's a nice starting point to think about identity, but there's so much more than this. If you think about your own lives as teachers or as teacher educators, and think about how you go about constructing and negotiating, you're always negotiating who you are as language teachers. How do you come about constructing these identities? Well, you have, as we've already established in the first few slides, your personal identity. This is the identity that, you know, your biography, your identity that is not your teacher or your professional identity, but it overlaps with who you are as a professional. When you walk into the classroom, you don't leave your personal identity outside. You bring it into the classroom with you. And if you think about how that professional identity is constructed, I'm going to list a number of factors. There are many more, but I just want to give you some to think about. And for those of you who are considering writing your teacher narratives, these may be some ideas for you to think about when you are writing your narratives. For example, the institutions you work in. You know, primary school, secondary school, universities, different types of primary school, rural, urban, different types of institutions will relate to your teacher identity, the way you see yourself and the way others see you, right? And of course, as you move from institution to institution or stay in the same institution over time, so your identity will change as well. The roles that we play as teachers, whether we are, let's say, a leader, a head of a department, maybe you have a curriculum development role or in charge of assessment, or you're an instructor or maybe an assistant teacher. So you have different roles that, again, will reflect on your identity. As teachers, we are thinking beings, right? We don't just implement a syllabus, but we reflect on it, we think about it. We have theories and beliefs about teaching. Again, teachers with different theories and beliefs will have different identities, also our different experiences, different histories. Not only teaching experiences, but language learning experiences as well. Our teaching practice, what we do in the classroom, how we do it. Not only does our identity influence those practices, but vice versa. What we do in the classroom will also shape who we are, our identities. The materials we use. Now we're all going online or have gone online, struggling to go, you know, hybrid teaching, blended learning. This relates to our changing teacher identities. Some people are taking leadership roles with online and doing teacher training. I see webinars all the time advertised for you know, moving online, how to teach better online, how to improve your practice, materials, but not only technology, other types of materials, furniture in the classroom, textbooks, worksheets, these objects that we use all the time relate to our identities. Emotions and desires. All the time when we talk about teaching and who we are, infiltrated with emotions, all the time, the desires, who we want to be, how we want to be seen, you know, what we are planning for ourselves with our development in the next few months, in the next few years, and the emotions attached to those desires. And then just one more, you know, as I said, there can be many more of these, but we take a moral stance in our practice and in the work we do as professionals. You know, we believe certain things should be done or shouldn't be done. Some things are right, some things are wrong. So these are all related to each other. All of these aspects are very much interrelated in terms of the professional identity. So yes, it's how we are recognized by others in a particular context and how we see ourselves in terms of all of these and many more as well. And this always reminds me of this quote from Suresh Kanagaraja, where he says, there's always the possibility that one will face tensions between one's teaching and social identities. So if you go back, you know, the teaching identity and the personal or social identity, and often there'll be tensions, is what Kanagaraja is saying here. However, these tensions keep one evolving as a teacher. So the tensions are not bad. These are dilemmas that keep us evolving as teachers, responding to one's changing identities and values as he or she brings them to inform teaching practice. So these tensions can be seen as motivating change, changing who we are, and relating then to what we do in our practice. I'm not going to read through this, don't worry, but this was a book that I edited a few years ago, Reflections on Language Teacher Identity Research, in which I asked over 30 practitioners, teachers, researchers, teacher educators, to talk about their work in relation to language teacher identity. And in the chapters, I asked them to try to define teacher identity, and to write about that definition in terms of their own biographies of teacher identity, short chapters. And what I did was, in the introduction, I did a thematic analysis of these chapters, and I put them all together into this one composite, what I call a composite conceptualization, one big fat definition of language teacher identity. And I'm not claiming that this is a definition. I'm just saying these are all those ideas put into one conceptualization. And some key words in this, as I said, I'm not expecting you to read it, but some key words here are that identities, language teacher identity, are cognitive. They're in the head. We think about them. We can reflect about them. We can make sense about them. They're also social, right? Because identities are constructed with others, with our learners, with others. They're not only constructed, but we negotiate identities with others. They're emotional, as I said a little earlier. We often fear things. We're nervous. I got too much work. I don't want to go to work on Monday. My workload is too heavy. I may not continue teaching. Or I love teaching. I got a great evaluation. You fear things. You hate things. You love things. There are all these emotions, often all at once, right? Identities are also ideological. These are political ideas. These are ideas that relate to sometimes macro institutions, sometimes even governments. So when we do our work in the classroom, often influenced through the materials we use, through the curriculums we follow. These are infiltrated by ideas at a much larger level. And they affect who we are. They affect our practice in the classroom as we set tests, as we assign group work, as we write materials. All ideological, creeping in all the way through. And sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. Their identities are historical. We have backgrounds, we have histories. As I said on the previous slide, identities don't just suddenly emerge. You wake up one morning. No, they come from a long history of our lives, where we've come from, who we've interacted with, where we've lived, how we've learned, and so Identities are being, who we are, but they're also, we do our identities, we perform our identities all the time. We show our identities, we project our identities to others when we interact with them. We imagine identities. When you are a pre-service teacher, you imagine yourself in the classroom on your first day. You imagine yourself in a few years' time being an experienced teacher, maybe even going to study abroad, or maybe leading a school. So, or maybe developing materials that can be used in a particular rural school. So you imagine identities for yourself. We have multiple identities, not only one. We've got social identity, professional identities, and multiple identities within those two categories as well. So we have these hybrid identities. They're mixed, so they blended together. As Kanagaraja said, sometimes these identities are contested. They are challenged. They come into conflict. Sometimes even within yourself, but sometimes by other people. You may get students disagreeing with who they think you should be. You may get your administrators challenging the way you teach or challenging your pedagogy. Or maybe they are instructing you to do something and you challenge them. And so you get this contestation going on. Sometimes that can turn out to be very stressful, a lot of tension created for teachers, but sometimes it can lead to identity change. Identities are therefore dynamic. They change. They're always shifting. You're never just one thing. We're not fixed. You're not just a primary school teacher. You're not only and always a secondary school teacher. Within being a secondary school teacher, there are multiple identities that are always shifting and changing as well. And what I want to talk about now is that identities are stories. We can story, if you use it as a verb, you can story your identity through the stories we tell, through the stories that we share, through the stories we hear other people, other teachers telling us, through the stories our learners, our students tell us in class, through the stories we observe around us. Story narrative is a very powerful way of trying to make sense of the lives we live as teachers. So through storying, through putting our life experiences into the shape of stories, we can make sense of those experiences. We can understand them, and then we can learn from them, right? There was a very good webinar just a week or so ago that I saw on YouTube by Kenan Dikilitas. Sorry, I didn't put his name on here. Who's at Stavanger University in Norway. And he talked about how teacher identity develops on one of his slides. Very, very useful categorization here, where he talks about internal factors and external factors, looking at teacher identity development. From the internal factors, he mentions one's commitment to learning, to be committed to learning as a teacher, and motivation to teach and to develop, to be motivated to develop. And the focus of his whole presentation was how we develop, how teachers develop through teacher research. And he focused particularly on action research, exploratory action research, exploratory action, exploratory practice, and so on. Wonderful presentation. Have a look at it on YouTube. So through the research that teachers do, or what I'd like to add is the reflection we do, reflection on our teaching as reflective practitioners, our identity develops. He talks also about the external factors, support from others, from other teachers, from administrators, and so on, from our learners as well, and access to resources, being given opportunities, and earning recognition. So he mentions that through doing action research and being able to share one's findings, for example, or being able to show through poster presentations or workshops that one is doing this research, learning about one's teaching and developing professionally, one can earn some recognition from one's peers and from one's leaders even. So I'd like to add that I think that narrative, using narrative and stories, is one way to explore identity, in order to learn more about identity. This is David Block, who says that being a language teacher is an ongoing narrated process. He uses the word narrated, that by being a teacher, we are narrating our lives as teachers, which brings together experiences in the past and present, as well as those anticipated in the future. So I love this quote because it's got this time dimension. It's got, you know, the typical biography, the history of the past relating to what we're doing now, and then anticipating the future, looking ahead. So there's narrative dimension to what it is to be a language teacher, our language teacher identity. So I just want to talk a little bit more about story before I talk further about how we can use story to explore identity. So story, of course, means different things to different people. So when I'm talking to you now about using story to explore identity, our own identity and others' identity and so on, I acknowledge that story means different things to different people, right? So different cultures have different ways of describing what a story is, or how different socioeconomic groups do as well. Even, you know, people at different times may see stories as being different at different ages, potentially, maybe different genders even have different perspectives on story, and even individual people at different stages of their development may have different ideas of story. So when I talk about story, I'm not talking about one kind of story. I'm saying that, you know, you can see from your perspective your idea of what story is. You know, how do stories differ? Well, they differ in the content, what they are about, for example, the organization, the sequencing of that content, how they actually told. So there may be cultural or age or gender differences in the way that stories are actually told, that the way the content is, and the way the content unfolds in the story, in the telling. So what's in and what's left out, so what can and can't be told. There may be certain restrictions, perhaps cultural restrictions, or other ways or constraints, rather, in terms of what can and can't be told. And of course, stories differ in terms of the choice of semiotic resources, in terms of what language is used, what other, you know, gestures, facial expressions, what other objects may be used, digital aspects, and so on. So the different ways in which stories can be told or shared, and that depends on these different groups, I guess you could call it, socioeconomic, age, so on and so on. When I talk about story, I like to think of these I think of 4 or 5 different ways in which stories differ. So when I talk about stories, this is what I think about. You know, this is my perspective. See if you agree or not. Maybe you think of story in a different way, and that's fine. People have different perspectives on what story is, as I've just said in the previous slide. But when I think about story, I think of that stories narrate experiences from the past or the imagined future. So it relates to experience, something that has been lived or imagined by the narrator. They tell about something that has happened or will happen, right? Relates to experience. But they also include some reflection or evaluative commentary on those experiences. So it's not just this happened, that happened, that happened, but there's some reflection about what happened, or some evaluation. This happened and it was terrible. I never want to go through that again. And then this happened. It was the happiest day of my life, or it was a horrible experience. So some evaluation, some commentary on the things that happened. That adds, you know, it makes the story more tellable. It's something that you'd be more interested in listening to. It's not a shopping list, right? You want to say something about what happened. They typically have a temporal or a time dimension. In other words, something happens over a period of time. You know, like if you think of literature, there's there's a plot, right? Something happens. There's some action happens over time. So they embody action. Something happens in the story, and I think a lot of this is missing sometimes from narratives. This dimension of narratives is often missing. I think it's nice when there's something happens, some action happens there, right? Makes it a story. And stories always make reference, either implicitly or explicitly, to who was involved in the story. So these are the characters. You know, who was involved in the story? The characters in the action world when the story took place. So there's some time dimension, as I just mentioned, and where or what happened. So the place or the setting, but also social spaces or ideological spaces. If you look at it this way, who was involved or the characters when the action took place in time and where it happened. So it's a place, social and ideological spaces. I mean, this is not new. Those of you who studied literature would be very familiar with characters and setting and plot. It's nothing new. But what is useful, I think, is when you are constructing narratives, writing narratives, or when you're reflecting on stories, either your own stories, or if you're doing some action research and you want to look at some stories that relate to identity, I think it's quite useful asking these three questions: who, when, and where. It helps you to focus on what the story is about, on the content of the stories. It just helps you to focus in some way on the content of those stories. Just have a look at this story. It's a little longer. This is a story told by Anna. Now, she is an English teacher from the South American country of Colombia. And in Colombia, she's very experienced English teacher. She's done quite a bit of action research. She's also supervised some action research. She has done some English teacher education. So she has worked with student teachers as well. And what she desires, she wants to get a full-time job teaching in a university. So she's taught in numerous language schools. She's had some part-time work in a university and so on. But she wants a full-time job in a university. But one of the dilemmas she is facing in her life is that in order to get a full-time job at the university, she needs research experience and she needs publications. So she needs a certain type of research, not the type of research that she does, action research, working with teachers in teacher education courses. She needs to do the type of research that is counted and measured by universities, right? That's published in academic articles that are, that are published as articles in academic journals, books, that sort of institutional academic research. So she tells a story. Remember, I'm talking about stories here, right? Where she shows how her identity is, there's a tension in her identity here. If you look at the different colors, the red refers to her as the narrator. She is the narrator. This is the who, not only her as narrator, but the other people. So asking the question, who is in the story? This is the red. The green refers to the time dimension. I would love to in the future, every year, every 2 years. So you can see it's a time dimension. And the blue refers to either a place or a space or a social space or an ideological space, right? So you've got the red, the characters, the time, and the space or the place in the story. So she's telling the story about this identity dilemma, the researcher identity dilemma in her life. She says, but I would love to carry out research, but what I don't like is the system in which the research should be like this, like that. And you have to publish every year, every 2 years. I think it's wild. Look at the emotion here. I think it's wild. She hates it, right? She hates the idea that the type of research you have to do is specified by the system. and you have to publish every year, every 2 years, and it's got to be this type of research and that type of research. So there's this dilemma. She hates it. Her identity is this tension, right? Line 6 is like, you have to produce a lot of research to show it's like, I'm doing this research, right? It's like, essentially, you've got to do the research just to show that you are doing research. That's her argument. So she says, I say, so why should you be doing that? Yeah, like, no, I want to do research to impact the local community. So look at these people now, in this space, this different space, different from the system. The system, these are the people that are requiring specific type of research. The local community is the type of research she wants to work with. She wants them to benefit from her research, to impact the teachers, not with the pressure of publishing, okay? And all that goes with that ideological space, the pressure of publishing and showing off, right? Oh, I had 3 publications this year. I had 10 publications. It's showing off. Meanwhile, what impact does that research have? She says, I mean, nobody problematizes that. Like, is publishing for the sake of publishing? And I think this is what the system is doing now, at this time. This is what the system's doing. Nobody is problematizing that. She says, like, the teachers should get publications very frequently. So again, saying what the system requires from the teachers. Otherwise, they are not like respected scholars. Oh, that's how you get respected, by publishing lots very frequently. It's like, is this okay? Being sarcastic here, right? You see her emotions coming through as she's revealing her identity in this story. Her emotions, is this okay? Right? And sometimes I see the education like going around just publishing for having respect. Respect, okay, doesn't really mean respect. And that scares me. So that's serious. That scares me. Look at that strong emotion. That scares me. Yeah. Why does that scare you? Because I'm scared of doing a research for the sake of the publication, not because you want to improve a situation. Well, that's needed. There's work that needs to be done, but they don't respect that. Or because you want to understand a practice better. She wants to relate her research to a practice that she wants to explore and to understand better. But that doesn't get respected. The only respected scholars are those who are publishing very frequently in the appropriate journals, right? So you can see this dilemma, this identity dilemma in her life, very strongly coming through in this teacher's and this teacher educator's professional life. I'm just aware I need to move on. I could talk about this for the next hour because it's such a powerful story. My point is, this is a story that was written, that was told to me by a teacher. We could write stories like this too, right? And we can then analyze these stories. And in analyzing them, by asking who, where, and when, we can learn so much more about them. This is just a diagram I put together showing this identity dilemma in the teacher's life. This is the academic institutional research pulling in one direction, and the teacher research, which she calls meaningful research, is pulling in the other direction, and she's stuck in the middle. She wants to get a job at the university, but she needs to do this type of research. And so what she eventually did was she signed up for a PhD so she could get experience doing research and get some publications, because she wanted to get this full-time job at university. If you want to read about the study, there's a reference here at the bottom. So you've got this who, where, and when questions here, which forms a sort of 3-dimensional space. So these questions are quite nice to ask because if you look at them as 3 dimensions, they form a space where the story is located, where the content of the story is located in that space. But it's important also, and I won't spend too much time on this, but it's important also to remember that when we're interpreting the stories, we need to look beyond just the immediate small micro space of the teacher's life. Sort of, I've called it small story with all small letters, just a small circle here, the personal, intimate social interactions of the teacher. where she lives the story. We have to look beyond that also at story with capital, with a capital S. These are the biggest spaces, the meso spaces, the staff room, the neighborhood, the community, the school, in slightly longer periods of time. So interpreting Anna's story and interpreting the teacher who went on study abroad, we got to make sense of it, not only in just what's happening now in her immediate life or in the immediate moment in this space, but we need also to interpret it by moving out more broadly, to see what's going on in the school. You know, maybe are there pressures coming from the school? Why is she doing this in this way? Like with Anna's story, it was very obvious that there were big pressures about having to publish research. In fact, macro story with capital letters, these sort of neoliberal institutions that are forcing our research to go to particular places, publish in particular places. And not only that, but they've got to take a particular format and they've got to be measured and be accountable every year. You know, so many, 2 articles, 1 book, everything's counted, you know, these broader ideological contexts of teaching and learning. So when we're constructing our identities in groups with our learners in the classroom, these broader spaces, you know, are all impacting, infiltrating, dripping down, filtering down to how we're constructing our identities at the micro level. And I guess if you think, you know, you can combine the two, where you can ask who, where, and when, the 3 who, where, and when questions, as well as interpreting them from the story dimensions as well. Just not forgetting that, trying to understand our stories of who we are, what our identities are. We need to look beyond just the micro, just the small. Perhaps another simpler way of looking at it is like this, you know, asking who, where, and when with you and your classroom, asking who, where, and when you in your school and community, asking who, where, and when in your world of big ideas and policies. You know, it's a nice simple diagram to possibly think about it. I wonder if I could just get a quick word on how much time I've got left.
Yeah, we are doing fine. We have another 15 minutes.
Okay, cool. Okay, thank you. I'll go. I thought what I would do for the time. So that's good. I thought what I'd do for the time we got left, you just have a look a little bit at how these ideas about identity can be brought into the classroom. So I was just saying, you know, this is vitally important, this you and your classroom, because this is where, you know, you do your main work, your main focus is as a teacher in the classroom, as a language instructor in the classroom. Of course, don't forget that what you do here in the classroom relates to these other dimensions as well. But let's have a look a little bit at what happens here in the classroom. Peter da Costa says that language teacher identities are constantly evolving and are developed through pedagogical practice. So through our work in the classroom, through pedagogy in the classroom, our identities are evolving and changing and being shaped and reshaped over time through the work we do in the classroom, right? And this is a quote from Bonnie Norton, who says, it is through language that a person negotiates a sense of self within and across different sites at different points in time. So through language and other semiotic resources as well, not only language, but other semiotic resources, but particularly language, because as language teachers, that's important to us. So through language, that's how we go about negotiating a sense of self. So one would think that if it's language that is central to our work as language teachers, and language is central to the way that we construct and negotiate our identities, it makes sense that language, that identity should be a focus in the classroom, right? Because language, through language, we construct our identity, and so therefore, identity should be something that we pay attention to in the classroom, that we reflect on, our learners as well as the teachers. Learners should be aware of identity. They should question their identities. They should explore identities. And there's been a long time, there's been a call to include or integrate identity into the language learner activities in the classroom. Some have gone as far as to say that, the language curriculum should be an identity-oriented curriculum. I mean, that may be quite hard to achieve, but less hard to achieve is to construct activities that focus on identity. So in this recent book that Amal mentioned at the beginning, called Communicating Identities, it consists of a number of activities designed for a communicative, well, for a language classroom. They're mainly communicative activities that focused on learner identities. So there's 48 different activities in the book, and they focus on many different aspects of identity. Important is that the activities are language learning activities. They're language learning activities where they are communicative language learning activities, focus on language. But in each of the activities, there's some focus on different aspects of the learner's identity, where they get to explore, talk about, question different aspects of their identities. And the book introduces research on identity. It also has a chapter on exploratory action research and narrative inquiry, where teachers get some basic tools for you to be able to use to explore identity in the classroom. But the main body of the book are these 48 different activities that are divided into these 4 sections on different facets of identity: reflecting identities, projecting identities, recognizing identities, and imagining identities. I won't go into too much detail, but just very, very quickly, reflecting identities is looking inwards, who we think we are, the self's view of the self. So it's, who I think I am as a teacher. It's my own view of myself. Reflexive going inwards, the inner self. So 12 of the activities are activities that relate to how the learners think about themselves, their own identities. Projecting identities is how we want others to see us. So this is how we project our identities to others. It's just the sort of public representation of the self, using language and other semiotic resources. You see this person here is projecting his or her identity to that person. There's very skillfully drawn identities here. And then we get recognizing identities. This is how others see us. So it's the counterpart of projected identity, how the projected identities are understood and acted upon by others. So 12 activities focus on recognizing identities. And then we have 12 activities on imagining identities, how we imagine ourselves in other times or in other places, and imagining ourselves participating in imagined communities. So, language learners imagining themselves being fluent English speakers in the workplace one day, or imagining themselves being able to pass the course so they can go to the next grade, for example. So imagining identity. So just have a look at one of their activities. This is the very first activity in the book here. Activity number 1, at a sort of elementary level. So students usually have access to a course book or a textbook in the language course, hard copy, electronic, whatever, some sort of materials. It could even be a series of worksheets, whatever. And this short activity asks students to flip through their course book for a few minutes to examine images or any other diagrams, keywords, figures, and so on that may or may not reflect how they see themselves. In other words, their identities. It's a simple activity. The students write down why this is the case and share their response in pairs. So they flip through some course materials, they look at diagrams, pictures, even colors, whatever, and then there's some structures given for how they can, some guidelines given for how they can. And there's an aim, elementary, some suggested time, and some idea about what skills are covered, and it's reflecting identities, right? So if you have a look here, it says ask students to take out their course books. So these are procedures for the teachers. Give students about 10 minutes to page through the course book or the textbook, or they can share books, whatever the notes, whatever materials they've got. Students will pick out 5 images, which could be of people or animals or objects, photos, drawings, figures, keywords, shapes, whatever. And for each of the 5 images, students write down the page number and then complete this sentence. This is like me because, and then complete the sentence, right? The page number, this is like me because, and it could be a picture of a woman. This is like me because I am female. Could be a picture of a cow in a field. This is like me because the grass is green and I like nature and want to save the planet. An advertisement for a new car. This is like me because I plan to be a mechanic one day, or whatever. They then find 5 more images and write the page number for each and complete. This is not like me because, okay, and then they do the not like me. After the students have 10 sentences, you put them into pairs, and each student has a turn to show one of their 10 images, referring to the page number, to their partner, and the partner then has to guess if the image is or is not like their partner, and then why or why not. Very simple exercise, right? And they each have a few turns, and then the teacher has an opportunity to talk a little bit about identity at the end. You know, saying identity is who we are, how we see others, how others see us, and so on. So just a sample. There are 48 activities. Some are quite complex for more advanced students. So these are activities for the learners. But what I wanted to show you was that for each activity, it ends with a teacher reflection, which may potentially be ideas for some exploratory practice, some narrative inquiries, looking at ways to write a narrative about a teaching episode, for example. And this is the teacher reflection at the end of that first activity. Next time you flip through the materials and documents you come across in your professional life, think about how the images, keywords, and diagrams reflect how you see yourself as a teacher, administrator, or researcher. Such materials may include your course books, syllabus documents, policy statements, so on, so on. So there's a reflection for the teacher that relates to the activity that the students have done. Okay, and is there some sort of research topic there or a teacher reflection? Here's another one from another activity. Students do not always feel comfortable expressing their opinions about certain issues in the classroom because it will reveal too much about what kind of person they are. The issues can be controversial and the opinions contested, which could cause students to feel threatened. Do you strive to create a safe space for the students to express their opinions? How do you achieve this? Are they able to be who they want to be? What boundaries should you set? Are there topics or issues that you do not allow to be discussed in your classroom? Do you feel free to express your own opinions about controversial matters? What limits do you set yourself? Okay, so nice questions to reflect on. Just another one here. This is in sort of multilingual contexts where you may have students from different nationalities. So this came at the end of an activity about national identities and sort of questioning even the idea of national identities. And students were asked to draw on these figures their own national identity using colors and pictures and words and so on. And the same task is then given to the teacher for reflection. And it asks, would you prepare to show your diagram to your colleagues or even to your students for that matter? So a whole bunch of different teacher reflections that could be used to think about one's own developing identity. I think I'll stop there. It's just about time. And I think we'll have some questions, if that's okay. So, I mean, I could go on, but I think it's about time. Spoke about stories, spoke about identity, spoke about identity in the classroom. I think that's about it.
Thank you, Professor Barkhuizen. This was such an engrossing story. I loved the fact that you storied the whole concept of teacher identity, and I can see a lot of us, a lot of teachers on all the platforms, and listening to you with a lot of interest, and also asking questions that I think might help all of us understand some of the concepts that you've introduced a little better. So, because you ended by talking about reflective exercises for teachers in the book, let me begin with a question from Prithviraj Thakur, who asks, what is the role of reflective practice in shaping teacher identity? And there are other questions of the similar nature, but I'm kind of flagging this one. Would you like to respond to that?
Okay, so that's quite a loaded question in a way. It's a very good question because reflective practice is something that teachers are always encouraged to do. In teacher education courses, a lot of reflection takes place in teacher education courses. I hear all the time that once teachers leave their teacher education courses and get busy in the classroom, there's not that much time for reflection or systematic reflection. So there's that to come, that hurdle to get over. But once you start reflecting on one's practice, reflecting on not only practice, but reflecting on who one is, reflecting on the things that go on around one in the school and so on. As I said, particularly, in a very simple way by asking who, where, and when, for example, it's unavoidable that identity is going to be is going to be involved, because if you looked at those two excerpts, those two stories I showed you, everyone started with I, from the narrative perspective. I did this, I do that, I want to. So immediately you start with I. You're looking at it from the perspective of the teacher, from the perspective of the narrator of that particular reflection. So that means immediately it's relating to the experience of that narrator. And therefore, it's about identity. It's about who that narrator is. And then if you look at the who, where, and when, look at the when. Often the when will refer to the past and sometimes to the future. So then you can explore the past and the future, not only about what's happening now, but I want to in the future. So I want to, or I did, or I am. So you look at those tenses and you can see that it's referring to different time dimensions. And then you ask questions about what is going on in those future times or the past times and so on in relation to the teacher. So I think those three questions, which are so typical of narrative, that's a good place to start if you do want to focus on identity in any type of reflection, which could be in writing, which could be in sharing, in having conversations with colleagues. A nice way is to record the conversations and then listen to them again, and then focus on who, where, and when. Whenever I suggest who, where, and when, people say, oh, what about what? What about why? What about how? You got to stop somewhere, right? You can't ask forever. So I like who, where, and when because they are they're typical of narrative, the characters, the plot, and the time. And then once you've done that analysis, then you can start asking why and how and so on. But as I said, you're looking at those two examples, they definitely started with, they definitely were from the perspective of the teacher. And once that happens, you're caught into identity straight away.
Thank you for that response. And it brings me to my second question, which is, how does one negotiate or balance subjective experience with objective reflection while you are narrating your story in your teacher identity narratives?
Yeah, so perhaps a question I would ask is, why would one want to do that, right? because in reflecting, you are reflecting on your own subjective experience. And I don't think you can aim for objectivity. Why would one want to do that? Particularly from a narrative perspective, it's your story, it's your experience, and you want to highlight that. The word I use, reflexivity, that reflexing identity. You want to highlight and reinforce that it is your story that you are focusing on. I think if you try and take yourself out of it, you're going to lose a lot of understanding those experiences. I think you have to acknowledge that even in doing more systematic narrative research, you don't aim for objectivity. You embrace subjectivity, because these are your stories. If it's narrative inquiry about oneself, a sort of auto-narrative inquiry, you embrace the subjectivity and you explore it in as much detail and with as much passion as you can. And that's where you really get the understanding. Trying to be objective with one's narratives is, I think, very difficult to do, and I think shouldn't be the aim, because you're trying to make meaning, you're trying to understand, you're trying to really figure out what's going on in your reflections and in your inquiry. And in order to do that, you've got to dive right in yourself. You have to dive right in and look around and try to figure out what's going on. If you step back, you're not going to get that same level of engagement with the story, and therefore with understanding of that story.
Thank you for that. On a slightly different note, Zahra Akbari is asking, she's watching on YouTube, and she wants to know, her point is, ESP teachers' professional identity is usually threatened by content teachers or field specialists. How can we get around this problem?
Yeah, I can see that question. I mean, that's something I can't solve. I mean, that is highlighting a particular identity dilemma, and that's an excellent example of an identity dilemma. But I can't solve that. I can just point out that it's an identity dilemma. That's an institutional matter, right? And it's also a disciplinary matter. It's something that that happens in a range of different fields. I mean, at some institutions, if you are a teacher educator, you perceive differently from being an academic of other disciplines in the same university, for example. So that's a different dilemma that teacher educators, a different identity dilemma that teacher educators and even longer term, that's when negotiation really comes into it. But sometimes, we can just be ourselves. We talk about English expression, just be yourself, where in interactions in your classroom. I mean, I teach many classes where I can just go in and I feel quite relaxed and I don't need to feel that I'm doing any negotiating or any identity work as such. But in other cases, I find that I'm working on my identity much, much more because of some sort of contestation that's going on. It may be misperceived, maybe it's not, but sometimes it's quite explicit. It's coming from students, or it's coming from administration, or coming from other pressures in one's life, maybe personal pressures. And then there's that negotiation where you need to reposition or reshape where you are, who you are, and so on. So that's the type of negotiation, which I think we're doing just about all the time, but there are times I think that we're sort of cruising, and we're always working on identity, but it's the negotiation I think comes in when there's some contestation or some resistance or some challenge, perhaps. I hope that helps answer the question.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That's a very interesting perspective. I'm not sure whether I am audible, but I have a question for you, which is, I'd like to go back to your first story, the story of the Cambodian teacher that you shared with us. And I'm curious to know how her story affected your identity as a teacher educator. It was wonderful to listen to her identity information or development. How did that affect you? My question is coming from a point where I want to know what is the benefit of listening to someone else's identity story? What is the benefit for myself and for the person, for the audience I'm writing for?
Okay, I think I got your question. You were sort of shaking a bit there, but that was interesting. I mean, I didn't tell you about the whole study. I just gave you a short sample quote, but that was a study that my colleague Rosemary Vetter and I have been working on for a couple of years. And I, in fact, never taught that particular student for a number of reasons. I had a big administrative job, and I also was on academic leave. But we were able to get some funding to work on a joint collaboration across the university on study abroad. And my colleague Rosemary and I were aware that there was a group of students from Cambodia that were doing our Masters in TESOL. And they were the typical study abroad students who came to do a qualification, which was one categorization of study abroad students, like international student really. And so we had funding to be able to work with this group of students at the end of their studies here and immediate post-sojourn, a month or so after they got back, because we were going to Cambodia and we thought we could follow up with them. So my learning from it had two perspectives. One three actually. One as a researcher. So through engaging, there were, I think there were six participants. She was one of the six. And so through engaging with her, they also wrote reflective journals for us. And there were 3-4 interviews. So as a researcher, I learned from being involved in that study. And I was able to reflect on my own work as someone involved as a researcher in study abroad. But we also learned about our Masters in TESOL program. So we were able to learn from the experiences of those students. We do course evaluations and all that, but they're never as detailed as the information we get from the interviews with these students. So as teacher researchers, as teacher educators, not immediately involved with those students, but from the perspective of working in the program, we learned enormous amount, and still are, because we're working on that data. So as someone involved in the program, we certainly were able to learn from it. But not so much just from that story, but as a narrative researcher, I have a concept called narrative knowledging in narrative inquiry, which refers to the meaning making or understanding people's experiences through the different processes of narrative research. So from even doing the interviews, while doing an interview, if it's an interview, for example, in that process, you are learning about the narrative experience, about the experiences of the person who's sharing that narrative. So I call, it's knowledging. I use it as a verb because you are learning in the process of sharing the narrative. And then when you got the data and you're analyzing the data and transcribing the data, then that knowledging continues. And so, and then when you're writing the report, that knowledge further continues. Even when you share it in a report and someone reads it, the person who's reading it also narrative knowledges because they are then learning at the same time, all about the experiences of the person who shared the story in the first place. So there's this continuous stream of learning through narrative, through storytelling, all the way. And so the researcher is intimately involved in that, learning about the experiences of who is telling and sharing the story.
Thank you. I will take one last question, and this is from Anna, and she is on YouTube. Anna wants to know the difference between analyzing an interview from a narrative perspective and from a methodological interpretive perspective. I don't know what the connection between the teacher identity perspective, but I'm sure you will be able to take it from that perspective. I'm sorry, Anna, I'm not sure if I said your question correctly.
No, I can see that one there. So I think from a narrative, well, it depends. So there's not only one narrative approach, right? So if you look at narrative inquiry or narrative and different types of narrative analysis, so there's a range of different approaches. So there's just to clear that up, first of all, there's just not one way. Just as, if you look at other methodological interpretive perspectives, there's not only one way there either. So there are multiple ways. So with narrative, for example, if you do the interview, with an interview, when you do the interview, sometimes you don't find any particular stories in the interview. There may just be short sentences in the replies to your questions. Or if you ask them to tell you about something, you may not get stories. Sometimes you do actually get stories in the answers to questions during interviews. So you have actual stories there, depending on how you define story, that is. So if you've got stories, I mean, one of the approaches I use is called short story analysis, which I've written quite a lot about. So you can analyze the stories you find in interviews. Another way is to do like a thematic analysis of the interview, which is very much like typical qualitative research, thematic analysis or content analysis. With narrative inquiry or narrative research, what's often done with interview data is to configure the interview into a story. So the researcher writes a story or constructs a story based on the interview or multiple interviews or whatever the case may be, or combinations of those. So I think what makes it different from different interpretive perspectives, phenomenology and so on, is that you're working with story. So you're working with the experiences, obviously, of the narrator and the researcher typically, and that you're doing something with story, either interpreting stories or you are doing thematic analyses of interviews and maybe configuring that into stories. So I think stories is what makes it different. Now, some people, I must say, do typical qualitative analyses and call it narrative analysis, but I have some questions about that because I ask, where's the story? I want to see the story. So I feel with narrative inquiry, I like to see the story there. So perhaps I'm a little more conservative in terms of what I define as narrative inquiry. Other people are way more sort of flexible and would, you often see some studies that are very, very qualitative and they talk about the teacher's narrative. I say, where's the narrative? Where's the story? Just because it's writing about experience, does that make it a narrative? Yeah, well, some people would say yes, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with it. But different people have different definitions of what narrative is, what story is. and what qualitative research is. So, you know, it's a very interesting question. I teach a whole course based on that question. So, you know, I can't answer in 2 minutes, but I can answer in a semester.
Thank you.
Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Thank you so much for your questions and for your talk and for your responses to the questions. I think I'm on a poor network, so I will stop here and hand over to Krishna to conclude the program. Thank you, Professor.
So thanks a lot, Padmini. So I'm sure that we have now a great start of the day with this fantastic session on teacher identity stories. I take this opportunity to thank Professor Gary for such an insightful and comprehensive session and helping us in knowing, in following, in understanding this topic, this construct, teacher identity. And there is a lot of stuff actually to munch over for all of us, and I'm sure everyone will do that. And another thing I would like to note here is this session has come at a very right time. This will help us in our recently started venture in publishing teacher narrative. So thank you very much, Professor Gary. And I also take this opportunity to thank all our audience scattered across 3 different locations, 3 different planes, here in the Zoom room, on YouTube channel, and as well as Facebook for sparing time. So wishing you all a very happy Teachers' Day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.